gastrovasticular cavity. So think about dermis, like your skin, derm layer kind of thing. It's like germ layer. Dermis is sort of like a tissue covering. Mesoglia is sort of the other side, sort of this tissue that makes up the jellyfish, the jelly portion of it. It's tissue. It's not very complicated though. It's pretty simple. And so that's sort of our basic breakdown of how the body's put together. Okay. They have a very, very super simplified, what we call a nerve net. So they have some nervous tissue that extends around their body. They don't have a brain or anything complicated. Essentially, they have neurons that can interact with one another and they can send nervous impulses back and forth. And so they're able to coordinate some reactions to the different things, some stimuli they can respond to. They don't actually have true muscle because they don't have mesoderm. Muscle comes from mesoderm. And so they have cells that are able to create contractile movements, kind of like a muscle does, but they're nowhere near as complicated and as advanced as a muscle type cell. So they have cells that are contractile, especially in the gastrovascular cavity, so the lining of the stomach and then the outer area, which can contract. So they can perform, rather complicated movements, but nothing on the order of what we would do or the power that a true muscle can perform. But if you think about how a jellyfish swims, pretty simple, sort of undulation of contractions. They're able to move their tentacles in a very basic way. They're able to perform movement, even though they don't have true muscles. So we're talking about a pretty simple body structure and style and makeup, but very, very successful nonetheless. So let's think about these two body forms. We've got a bunch of different groups within the Cnidaria. The corals and anemones, they exist as polyps, so they're attached to something. And so that's pretty obvious to see. Obviously these aren't corals, these are anemones, these are anemone fish in there, so it's the anemone is a round fish there. The jellyfish are predominantly the Medusa phase, the free-swimming phase. There's a couple of different subgroups within the jellyfish group. One's called Scyphozoans and one's called Cubozoans. And the only reason I bring that up is because I'm going to talk about Cubozoans a little bit later in the lecture. Pretty much, if it has a round bell, it's a Scyphozoan. If it has a cube-shaped or box-shaped bell, it's a Cubozoan. So it's kind of a way of identifying different families of jellyfish from the bell, their body, and how it's shaped. So they're predominantly Medusa, although they can have a polyp phase in their life cycle. And then the Hydrozoans, we hoped you would see a Hydra in lab this week, but they all died, so maybe you saw them. You would have saw a picture of a Hydra, which are these guys. Hydra are in the Hydrozoan group, and they alternate between a polyp-like or body type and a Medusa body type. So this is kind of like the alterations of generations idea with your plant section, where you've got some plants that go back and forth from a gametophyte back and forth, right? And so you got some animals or some plants were predominantly gametophyte and some were predominantly the sporophyte. Remember that? In this group, we kind of have the same thing. Some are predominantly one body form or another, and then some kind of go back and forth. So their life cycle can be kind of complicated, but I wouldn't say it's anywhere near as complicated as what you do with plants. So if we look at the Hydrozoans as an example, this is a group that definitely alternates back and forth between the polyp phase and the Medusa phase. They're a good group to study this in. You can see we start with the polyp phase. Here's a feeding polyp. So you've got a ring of tentacles around that. That's your individual Hydra there, or Hydrozoa. It's attached to a stalk. Sometimes you get multiple individuals on one stalk, creating like a colony. Sometimes these feeding polyps will modify themselves into what are called reproductive polyps. So they will convert into a reproductive polyp, and they will start to produce offspring, if you will. So they will asexually produce a juvenile little baby free-swimming Medusa. So those little baby medusas are actually called ephyras, or ephyras. They're like miniature, poorly developed medusas, little larval phase medusas. And what happens is that reproductive polyp starts to form into this thing called a strobila, where it becomes like it almost looks like a flower with these little layers on it. And each of those little layers become little discs that pop off and create free-swimming individual ephyras. We've got a video to explain or show how that works. So here's a little reproductive polyp, and what you'll see is that it starts to, so now it's got its tentacles, it's going to change into a reproductive polyp. Just going to fast forward a bit here. And then it's going to create these little discs of itself, and then you'll see at some point these little baby medusas essentially bud off and swim away. There they go. So this is asexual reproduction, right? It's an animal just creating part of itself that it can release, and now it's its own new individual. So that's an ephra, or ephyra, depending on who you ask. Here's another little video of those. Little baby jellyfish. They're not very good at swimming. They're able to swim around a little bit, but eventually they will develop into a mature medusa form. It's much better at swimming. So we go through this phase of development here, and we're only at the first sort of little part of the life cycle. So they asexually produce a medusa, or many medusas, and then those medusas are either male or female. So the females produce eggs, the males produce sperm, and once mature, they can release those eggs and sperm, and the egg can be fertilized by sperm. So this is obviously sexual reproduction at this point. So meiosis is the production of the gametes. So you go from diploid to haploid, so two end to one end, and then the one ends get together to form another diploid fertilized egg, which we then call the zygote. Right, so right here we have asexual reproduction and then sexual reproduction within the life cycle. The zygote then develops into something called a planula larvae. And the planula larvae is this really simple little blob with little cilia all around it, and it can free swim. So it can move from place to place, not a very good swimmer, but it can move a little bit, and eventually it will find some new place to settle down, and it will attach itself to the ground somewhere, and will develop into a polyp, completing the life cycle. So maybe you're noticing that this little larva looks a lot like the sponge larva that we talked about last class. It's very similar actually in structure and how it moves. So it's very, very closely related in that way. Also has the same sort of function. It's a motile part of the life cycle that can go from one place to another, then it settles down to produce a new adult individual. In the case of the sponge, it would produce a new sponge. In the case of the cnidarian, it's going to produce a new polyp. So that's going to develop, and then we can repeat the life cycle. So both asexual and sexual reproduction in here. In these animals, we've got both the medusa and the polyp phase being kind of similar in how important they are. But in some of the other groups, it's just one or the other. So I would say not as complicated as the plant, some of the plant reproductive life cycles, but definitely more complicated than what we would use or show in our life cycle, for sure. So that's our cnidarian life cycle. They also can produce through asexual means, which are much more simple. So here's a hydra right here, and you can actually see a little bud of a hydra growing off the stalk. So they can just randomly produce a bud of themselves and create a new polyp on their stalk. So they can just do that asexual reproduction. So you see that commonly happening. this is what we, question, yeah.
Is there any environmental factor that leads them to do one or the other?
The question is there any environmental factor that leads to one or the other? I would say just in general, if you have any challenging environment or maybe a lack of individuals around you that you can mate with, then asexual reproduction would probably happen more commonly. And I think that would just be a general way to think about most animals. Yeah. One of the things we usually do with the hydras in the lab, so if they had survived, is we throw them in with some Daphnia. And so what sometimes we're able to capture is, or watch them feeding. So this is a hydra here. It's got you can see the tentacles going around this little stalk here attached to the bottom of whatever this is in. Here's a Daphnia that's swimming by. So this is their feeding mechanism. So they're exceptionally good predators, which is kind of surprising by looking at them. They don't look like much. But those tentacles are incredibly dangerous. They're filled with these stinging cells that they can kill prey items that could be very, very much larger than them. And then they can engulf that prey item into their mouth and into their gastrovascular cavity and slowly break it down. So even something as simple and delicate looking as this hydra can be a really deadly predator, even for things that are much larger than it. So we'll come back to that prey or predator capacity a little bit later as we go through this lecture. So as I mentioned, the group has a variety of different subgroups. The Anthozoa, that's the term given for the group that includes the corals and the anemones. So these are sometimes called flower animals. You can imagine the first people that see these may not even thought they were animals. They kind of look like plants or something else. Obviously, beautiful group, many different colors and shapes and sizes. Some of the corals can be, much bigger than a person, so many feet across. Individual anemones can be humongous or very tiny. It just depends on the species. One thing you may not know, but that is important, is if you look at a big coral like this, it's actually made up of thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals. Each little polyp makes up one part of a giant colony. So if you zoomed in on one of these big corals here, you would see something like this. All kinds of little polyps, side by side by side. You can see each ring of tentacles and a mouth in the middle. Each of those individual polyps, you can call an individual coral. But then many of them together create a larger structure that we collectively think of as the coral. A lot of the corals we call hard corals because they're able to secrete a calcium carbonate shell, which creates what we typically think coral is, right? What you saw in the lab, you saw some of these rocks almost, they look like chalky rocks. Those are the remains of the corals. That's the coral skeleton, essentially. It's not the coral itself. It's a secretion that they've produced where they can hide and live on and allows them to have a home, essentially. But when the coral dies, all that's left behind is that calcareous rock. So if you looked at one of these that was dead, all you would see is little holes all over it. And each of the little holes would be where each individual little polyp once lived. So if you look at a large coral, what you're really seeing is many generations of corals living, secreting a calcium carbonate home, then dying, and then a new coral growing on top of that spot, and then secreting their own coral home, or their calcium carbonate home. So over time, the coral gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's just on the surface where the currently alive coral polyps are actually there. So over thousands of years, you can have a coral grow from a little thing to something that might be enormous. And in fact, the largest biological structures on the planet are coral reefs. So pretty impressive what they can produce over many, many generations. I was going to say the coolest thing about corals, I don't even know if I can say that. There's so many cool things about corals in this group. But this group exhibits mutualism with a symbiont. Okay, so this is actually super important to their success and their lifestyle. They exhibit a form of symbiosis we call mutualism, and mutualism essentially means that both members of the pair benefit from each other. So corals contain what we call endosymbiotic brown algae called zooxanthellae. So endosymbiont, it's like a symbiont that lives within them. So it's kind of weird to think about. So if you look closely at a coral polyp, you'll see something like this. So here's two different coral polyps side by side. You see a ring of tentacles. There'll be a mouth on the inside. Underneath them would be their calcareous shell, if you will, their coral home. The brown dots that are embedded in the skin or the tissue of this coral are actually living algae. So brown algae we call zooxanthellae. So like other algae, they are photosynthetic. They use the sun to produce sugars and oxygen through photosynthesis. So the corals essentially have this symbiotic relationship with an algae that literally lives inside them. And they take advantage of one another, in a good way, obviously. Okay. So the zooxanthellae are photosynthetic and obviously can turn light and CO2 into oxygen and sugar, as long as we have sunlight. And the coral can use those sugars and the oxygen as nutrients for their own development and growth. It's a really nice symbiotic relationship that really helps both organisms. The coral provides a safe home for the zooxanthellae to live, and then the coral gets nutrients from the zooxanthellae. So when it's nice and sunny out, the corals will extend their polyps, exposing the zooxanthellae to the sun. The zooxanthellae will photosynthesize, produce nutrients, which will then be absorbed by the coral. And so it's a nice, beautiful, harmonious relationship between these two very different organisms, one an algae and one an animal. This is one of the reasons why corals are so successful in some places. If you remember back to our last lecture about sponges, we talked about Darwin's paradox. How could these coral reefs, these super biodiverse, super successful communities exist in a place with almost no nutrients around? We talked about the importance of sponges for that particular, to help with that particular problem. And I told you there was two parts to it. The second part is the symbiotic relationship with the algae. The algae can produce nutrients from the sun, which can then be passed to the corals. So sponges and zooxanthellae are what create a favorable environment for the corals to do very well, even though the nutrient levels in the water are pretty low. Question?
Is the zooxanthellae dependent on the coral?
Yes, the zooxanthellae is dependent on the coral because it requires a way to attach to something and be exposed to the sun.
So with the decline of corals, because nowadays, are they seeing research, are they seeing a decline in the zooxanthellae population?
Absolutely. So have you heard the concept of coral bleaching? What coral bleaching really is when the coral gets stressed or starts to die, they eject or lose their zooxanthellae. So they lose a lot of their color, so they look bleached, and then eventually they die and they just look white. But it's this loss of their symbiont. And then once you lose your symbiont, things are a lot harder. So yes, absolutely, with climate change, yes, definitely ocean acidification and temperature rising, we're seeing large areas of coral reefs dying because of this loss of this relationship. So pretty cool biological connection here. Here's a zoomed in view of this as well. So these are the tentacles of one polyp. You can see a ring of tentacles here. There's a little mouth in the middle. Each tentacle is just full of these little brown circles. And those are little zooxanthellae living in the skin of this polyp. If we look at the sort of zoom into the coral itself, the pink or peach color is sort of depicting the coral, and then the green circle is the algae that's living sort of inside. You can see that the algae is taking in CO2 and water. using photosynthesis, which obviously requires light, to produce, in this image it says organic matter, that would be the sugars, the glucose, and then oxygen. And then those sugars and oxygen are absorbed by the coral, and they respire, just like we do, through respiration, to produce CO2 and water, which is then retaken up by the coral. And this is this perfect little recycling of CO2 and oxygen with the use of sunlight to make sugars. So both organisms, depending on one another, doing well because of one another, mutually beneficial here. This is mutualism, and one of the reasons why corals are pretty successful in the areas that they live. The calcium carbonate shell is actually outside of the animal technically. So we have our polyp here. Here's our ring of tentacles in the mouth going down to the stomach or the gastrovascular cavity. And then you can see that it's sort of sitting on this hard, chalky skeleton. The coral can secrete that chalky skeleton, produces a little hole here that it can hide in if something came along that wanted to, let's say, eat it. And that forms the hard part of the coral. So when this polyp dies, a new polyp may settle there, the new planula larva may settle there, and then grow a new polyp, and continue to secrete a new home below it. So the chalky skeleton over generations slowly grows over a long period of time. So looking at one coral, what we would call a coral, if you zoomed in, you'd actually see millions of individual polyps. All we should consider as individuals, but they living together on one structure that we would kind of think of as a coral, an individual coral. So it becomes difficult to say what's an individual versus a colony in some of these animal groups, but I would call each polyp an individual, but they are connected by this calcareous skeleton, essentially, of rock that they live on. Question?
Yeah, so I was just curious, like since they're so small, what would actually want to eat them?
Would we want to eat them?
Yeah.
Well, for reasons we're going to talk about in a second, not much. There are things that do eat corals. Those nudibranchs, remember those little slugs? They eat them because they are weird and do crazy things. But there's a lot of things that don't want to touch corals, but more because of their stinging capacity, which we're going to talk about next. Okay. So, corals can reach immense sizes, right? So one of the most impressive things in the world is the Great Barrier Reef. We have other barrier reefs around. But this is a biological structure formed by animals that can be seen from space. Okay, think about how big that must be, right? These hard corals that we find them in other parts of the world too, but this is the biggest one we know of, can grow to enormous sizes, can be thousands and thousands of years old. And we know that they are one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet, one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. And like I mentioned before, even though these areas tend to be pretty nutrient poor, they still do well because of the action of sponges and the zooxanthellae symbiosis. So, if you've ever been to a coral reef, you know how impressive they are and how beautiful they are. And if you haven't, I would totally put that at the top of your list of things to do, because it's just shocking how beautiful they are, and how easy it is just to watch things and all kinds of different beautiful fish and other things that are swimming around it. Totally recommend it. The Great Barrier Reef is, like I mentioned, the largest living structure on Earth. It's something like 2,000 kilometers in length. It includes thousands of interconnected reefs and islands. Imagine how long that would take to form, with individual little polyps creating little calcareous shells. There's actually over 600 types of hard and soft corals in the overall reef, and they create a home for many, many different species. So 6 species of sea turtles, 217 species of birds, 17 species of sea snakes, and more than 1,500 species of fish. This is about 10% of all the fish species of the planet live in the Great Barrier Reef. That reef creates a home for all these different organisms. So obviously very important from a global perspective to protect places like these biodiversity hotspots, essentially. So you may have thought about coral reefs and maybe thought about how they form and why there's different types of coral reefs, and they're actually, we sort of classified 3 different types of reefs. We have fringing reefs, atolls, and barrier reefs. And they're all slightly different, but they're actually all just different phases of what could be one reef. So what we typically see forming first is what's called a fringing reef. We'll talk about this in a couple of slides, but corals obviously like shallow water because they want to have lots of sunlight for their zooxanthellae. So they don't really form in deep water where there's not much sun. They're going to form in shallow areas, so usually along coastlines. Once the sea level goes down, like the drop off happens, the deeper you go, obviously, the less corals you have. So in these shallow lagoons or shallow areas along coastal areas, you usually have coral reefs develop. So you can swim off the beach and swim around, and you can see corals everywhere. Let's skip down to C, because I think the order of this should be A, C, B. What ends up happening over time is the corals actually continue to grow, and they can actually grow to the point where they hit the surface of the water, because they're growing upwards. Every generation they lay down a new calcareous skeleton, and those corals can grow upwards towards the surface. And at some point, they can actually reach the surface of the water. Or if sea levels go down, you can get this same sort of situation. Now, corals don't live out of the water, so they'll die if they actually come out of the water. But what happens if they get to the surface is that this calcareous sort of rock is sort of forming new land, if you will. And that can be colonized by other organisms. So you often get a lot of sand washing up on this new land. You get seeds from vegetation from local islands, so palm trees start to grow and other things start to grow. So you actually start forming what are called barrier islands. So barrier reefs are essentially sort of this in-between fringing reef and what eventually could become a barrier island off the coast of the landmass. So it's an animal producing new land, which is pretty cool. And often you'll get some form of lagoon forming there, and so you might have a little bit of deeper water before you get your coral, and then your potentially islands growing off the side. And then finally what will happen, and I'm going to show you another image in a second, these barrier reefs can form atoll reefs if the island itself sinks. Question?
Is there a difference in how reefs are able to establish themselves in the reef? Because we took in like the first half of the quarter that roots secrete like, I forgot what it was from, but like a substance to soften the soil so it's able to move around. But the reef is like hard and like it's like almost like a skeleton, kind of with roots.
So I don't know much about that, but definitely it would be the case. It's not soil, it's calcareous, it's very different in structure. You can imagine wave action is slowly wearing that down, creating more of a sand. And some plants are better at colonizing sandy areas, like palm trees, for example. So you would get those types of things first, and maybe some grasses, and then they would start to decompose and produce more what we would consider typical soil. So this is over many thousands of years, potentially, turning from a coral crust to more of a land soil, essentially. But once that happens, then new plants may be more likely to take up root, literally, and live in that area. So it's a good question, and one that I'm sure there's many papers on it, I just don't know that much about it. So the atolls form if the island sinks. So this happens in a lot of cases. A lot of these islands were volcanic peaks, and over time, for whatever reason, they sink back into the ocean. And so you've got a fringing reef forming first, maybe that becomes a barrier reef or a series of barrier islands. And then if the island disappears entirely, all you end up with is this ring of coral or ring of islands in these kind of weird circular shapes. So you can imagine first seeing these and thinking, how could this possibly come to be? Who put these here? They look so strange. Any idea who figured this out? That was also Darwin. He figured this out too. Give him credit for lots of things. The formation of atolls forms in this way. Again, this is over many, many thousands of years, these types of things can happen. But if you Google atolls, you see some of the most impressive islands you can find, some beautiful places. So I always wanted to go to an atoll. I'd never been. For my honeymoon, my wife and I were like, okay, we're going to an atoll reef. We're gonna finally do this. And so we went to French Polynesia, and we stayed in this little island called Tikahau, in the middle of literally the middle of nowhere, on an atoll just like this. And the average elevation of the island was less than 1 foot. It was like a sandy ring like this with some palm trees, essentially. Beautiful place, amazing. And there's a little resort there with just a few rooms. It was pretty awesome. But I was there for, I think, 4 or 5 days, and wouldn't you know it, when I was there was an earthquake off the coast of New Zealand, and there was a tsunami alert for the entire South Pacific. And so I just thought to myself, what are the chances? I finally get to this coral atoll, I'm standing on less than a foot of sand, and a giant wave's gonna come and kill me, right? So clearly that didn't happen, but it was a little nervous. We were a little nervous for about 24 hours there, waiting to see if anything materialized, and luckily nothing did. But there was nowhere to go. I don't know what would have happened. According to the guy that ran the hotel, we were just gonna go get in the boat and drive off into the middle of the ocean and hope for the best, but he didn't seem too worried, but I found the biggest surfboard I could find, and I was carrying it around in case some wave showed up. But luckily it didn't, so that's kind of my luck. But those are coral atolls. So corals are, remember, they're animals, right? So these are also very picky animals. They only live in very specific locations under very specific conditions. Because of their zooxanthellae, their symbiotic relationship with a photosynthesizing organism, they really need to live in shallower water that's pretty clear. Because you want lots of sunlight penetrating to wherever the coral is. So that makes it good for scuba diving or snorkeling, because you're obviously in a beautiful, clear, warm, usually shallow area. They only form under very specific temperature regimes, so they're pretty much limited to between 26 degrees north and south latitude, so around the equator. They don't do well with any dilution of the seawater, so they don't do well if there's river runoffs creating an estuary. They like full strength seawater. They don't like being covered with sand or silt, because that's going to sort of cover up their ability to show off their zooxanthellae. So they do like having some wave action that can keep them clean, essentially. And they don't like being exposed to air. So if the coral grows to the surface or the sea level drops a little bit, those corals are going to definitely die. So they're always subtidal. They're always kind of below the lowest tide level, essentially. So they're pretty picky on where you're going to find them. And if you looked at a global distribution of the corals, you can definitely see that that's the case. So they're going to be in shallow areas. They have to be along coastal areas, like islands or coasts. Obviously, around the equator, we get the corals, all the red areas there. So I was sort of over here somewhere. But even anywhere you want to find a coral reef, you're going to see something spectacular. So the Caribbean's not too far away. You can see some cool corals there. You get a chance to go to Southeast Asia, really nice. Thailand has some great corals. I still have a lot of places to go here. I haven't actually been to Australia yet, so that's obviously on the list too. The defining characteristic of the group, we haven't even talked about. The term itself, cnidaria, or cnidarians, has the root nide. And what nide are specialized cells that are found in all of the different species of this phylum. They are the specialized cells that sting you when you get stung by a jellyfish. They're used by these animals to kill and capture their prey. So their tentacles are usually loaded up with these specialized cells, which we call either nidocysts or nidae. And so the group is called the cnidarians, or the cnidarians. You'll also see a term nematocyst, sometimes used in older textbooks, it's the same idea. It's the same. It's like a stinging cell. So the definition of the group comes from this one characteristic of having stinging cells. And what they are these specialized cells that have a little harpoon-like structure attached to a thread-like structure that the animal can literally propel out of its body into potential prey. So anything that comes close or touches the tentacles of a cnidarian will probably cause these cnidae to fire and then lodge themselves into that prey. So that's supposed to show this little tentacle, maybe a hydra or something. You saw that hydra killing the daphnia. It had fired some cnidae into the daphnia. And so that causes mechanical damage to the predator, to the prey. It's got like little harpoons sticking in them. But in many cases, these animals also produce very venomous toxins that they can also secrete into the prey item when they sting. So this is one of the most impressive biological mechanisms we know of. It's arguably the fastest biological mechanism there is. This is happening as fast as neural transmission, super fast. And then the ability to produce, for some of these species, incredibly toxic venoms makes them really formidable predators, for sure. So has anyone had the unfortunate scenario where they were stung by a jelly or anything else in this group? Nobody? Oh. How was that? How did that feel?
Not fun.
Not fun? Okay. Where were you?
I think Costa Rica.
In Costa Rica? Do you know what it was? Was it a jellyfish?
Jellyfish, yeah.
Yeah. And then you got one too?
Yeah, it was like a beach that was filled with jellyfish, and it was awful. So bad.
Yeah, I've only been stung by like just gentle ones. Some of them you barely even feel. Other ones are like they could kill you. That's how bad they are. So you go to the Shedd Aquarium, actually, you go to the touch tank and they have little green anemones and you can touch them and you will feel them stinging you. It feels like they're like little suction pucks almost. They barely feel it, but it feels like they're, I don't know, it's like Velcro stinging you or something. It's really weird. But they're technically stinging you. That some of them are just very mild and then other ones are deadly. So you hopefully get stung by one that's not too bad. I've gotten stung by lots of jellyfish that are, it just feels like little pinpricks, but I've never had one that's like the excruciating pain that most people feel. So obviously you can Google this and see all kinds of grotesque images of people. Or you can watch a really terrible YouTube video about it, which we're gonna do. Videos on these things are always just too Hollywood for me, but that's what we got. So, how does a jellyfish sting?
If you simulate even a severed strand of tentacle with an electric pulse, the sting capsules react. Known as an nematocyst, the stinging capsule is unique to jellyfish. It's a complicated mechanism, and the fastest in the animal kingdom. Each tentacle contains billions of these harpoon-like structures. The process underlying their deadly firepower is revealed now for the first time using computer animation. Inside each of these nematocysts, a coiled tube bathed in venom. When triggered, the nematocyst explodes into the victim at 10,000 times the force of gravity. Like a sock being pulled inside out, the tube everts, releasing venom from all sides of the harpoon directly into the bloodstream.
So not necessarily something you want to experience, but something that's pretty common. I get this question every year. I blame Friends, right? We all know where that comes from, right? Right? You saw that on Friends. Can't remember who had to pee on who, but so that's like an old wives' tale. I don't even know if that's a proper term to use it, but that's an old idea that is not recommended because the ammonia in your urine is supposed to help to numb the pain, but it can also cause the firing of new nematocysts that haven't yet fired. So even if you find, like some people get stung by jellyfish that are dead on the beach. They'll like walk and step on one, or their kid will pick it up and then they'll sting them. Those, even after death, those cells can still fire after a while. A lot of them are triggered by a mechanical sensation, like a vibration or something like that. So any chemical or physical disturbance to them could cause more of them to fire. So the idea that you're supposed to do, although I would probably try it too if I was in a lot of pain, maybe have your friend pee on you, but what you're supposed to do is gently take some water, like in a bucket, and slowly pour it over whatever area the tentacle is on until it slowly washes off. Now, if you're getting stung and it's painful, you're probably not going to be that patient. You're going to probably just rip it off. But that's what's recommended. Because the seawater they're used to, it's not going to cause new nematocysts to fire. And if you do it gently enough, hopefully you can physically get it to just let go. But that still happens. Lots of people do that. So I'll actually show you a sign in a minute that will tell you to do that. So there's places that it's still recommended. But because it could lead to more nematocyst firing, it's not recommended. But that is something I get asked every year, and I love that. So, if you are at a beach and you see a sign like this that says, marine stingers are present in these waters during summer months, probably don't go in the water, right? Stingers, that's the Australian word for them, I guess. I love this sign because it suggests that women have to worry about it too. You go to beaches all over the world and you're going to see these things. Sometimes it's, like a beach will be closed for an entire season because a certain type of jellyfish might be kind of. This one's fun. No swimming if you can't swim. I think that goes without saying that there aren't any jellyfish around. The box jellyfish, or it's also called a sea wasp, is actually considered the world's most venomous creature. So if you see one of these, definitely don't go in the water. So this is where I introduced you to the idea of the Scyphozoan and Cubozoan names for a couple different classes of jellyfish. The Cubozoans are the ones with the cube-shaped or box-shaped bell. Some of those are really bad, like this box jellyfish. So if you see a jellyfish go by with a box shape to it, probably a good idea to get out of the water. So definitely a dangerous one. These ones kill people every year. Actually, one of my best friends in grad school, his master's thesis was to travel to different parts of the world getting blood samples from different fish species. So he had kind of a fun master's. But one day he was on a fishing trawler off the coast of New Zealand. He was about 3 days from shore. Imagine in some of the roughest water in the world. So he was very seasick. But then one of the days he was on the boat, he just leaned against the net that was hung up on the boat and got stung by a box jellyfish. And he had to get airlifted back to New Zealand or he would have died. Like that's how bad it was. So he almost died a terrible death in the middle of the middle of nowhere on a fishing trawler. But luckily was rescued in enough time to get him saved essentially. But even not even going in the water, you can get stung by these things if you get unlucky. So question there.
So I have these friends who moved back to Australia where they're from, and I always tease them that like nature doesn't want them to live there. Is there like a particular reason why there's so many of these
In Australia?
stinging creatures around Australia, or is it just because there's so many the reefs and it's like right in the
I have no idea, but it's like every dangerous thing you can imagine is there, right? Snakes and scorpions and spiders that can kill you and all kinds of these jellyfish. You're right. And maybe the reason I haven't got to Australia is that it's very true. It just seems like everything terrible goes there. But maybe that's why all the prisoners got sent to Australia. I don't know, back in the 1600s or whatever.
what does vinegar do? Does it do the same thing in water?
So this is the sign I was talking about. So vinegar contains it's acetic acid, so it's thought to neutralize the sting, kind of like the ammonia in your urine. And so you'll see signs like this that still say that it can help with the. So you're probably in a lot of trouble if you get to that. Okay, having said that, some animals do eat jellyfish, which is kind of crazy. I'm gonna show you a video of one of those. So I'm gonna show you videos also. Alright, so here's a jellyfish predator.
Green sea turtles love to fill their cast iron stomachs with venomous jelly. As the turtle devours its prey, it carefully closes its eyes to avoid the sting to sensitive corneas.
Alright, circle of life right there. See, if I showed you a video of something that feels like a turtle, you'd all be like, oh. But who cares about jellyfish, right? So there's a predator of jellyfish. Also those nudibranchs, those little shellless marine snails, somehow they eat jellyfish too, and corals and anemones, and they can actually incorporate the stinging cells into their body, which is crazy. So some really strange, very specific predators of cnidarians, yeah.
What allows these turtles to not be affected?
I don't know, so maybe it's eating a species that's not very venomous, but it's still probably stings, so if it's got a tough skin, it's probably fine. But,
I know
yeah,
they mentioned something about having its catch
they call it a cast iron stomach, I guess that's what they're trying to get at, that it's tough, I don't know. But my guess is it's not a super venomous particular species that this sea turtle's eating, but I don't know enough about which species of jellyfish turtles like this. So, and maybe we don't know yet, I don't know. Here's one more. This is Jellyfish Lake in Palau. Have you guys seen this place? Oh, we gotta try this one. So this is in Palau. So this is a lake that's still seawater. I'll show you a picture of it in a second. But it's got no predators of the jellyfish, and the jellyfish pretty much only have very small plankton that they can eat. So they've evolved to lose a lot of their stinging capacity. So you can go there and swim around in this lake, and you can see it's wall-to-wall jellyfish. If you watch different videos, you'll see people just swimming through jellyfish. It's almost like there's more jellyfish than water. And this is the lake here. It's separated from the ocean, but it's still seawater. So you don't get any like big scary sharks in there or anything either. So kind of a nice place to go if you get a chance. Alright, so study jellyfish, and maybe you can go to Palau or some other cool place and learn about some pretty cool organisms. Alright, we got a couple minutes left. I'm a little behind, right? That's okay. What I want to do is talk about one more group that's usually confused with the cnidarian. Okay? And that's a group called the ctenophorans. Okay? So this is a different phylogeny. I got it from a different textbook because it shows this group. A lot of phylogenies leave this one off because there's only about 100 species. This is not a cnidarian, this is a ctenophoran. So for whatever reason, the C is still silent in this group. It's on the same arm of the phylogeny as the cnidaria. And notice that it's also another of the radiata. So we're only going to talk about two groups that are radiata, radially symmetrical animals. This group is commonly just assumed to be in the same group because they're jellies, but they're not the same. These are called comb jellies, and they actually have some different structural components to them that I'll explain. But I want you to remember that they're separate phyla altogether. They just kind of look similar to the jellyfish we just talked about. So only about 100 species, but they're incredibly common. So my guess is if you went to a coastline or a shoreline in different parts of the world, you're just as likely to see a comb jelly swim by as you will a jellyfish. They're pretty common, even though there's not that many species. So the group is also diploblastic, so that's easy to remember. It's also radially symmetrical. So diploblastic, right, it only has the endoderm and ectoderm. They still have like a jellyfish-like body with a mouth. They still have tentacles that sort of look like a jellyfish too. But what makes them different is they have additional structures along their bell called combs. And they're called combs because they kind of look like the edge of a comb, like a comb to comb your hair. So essentially they have 8 rows of these combs, which are these lines that go around the bell. And those combs are made up of little tiny cilia that they can move. So the cnidarians don't have those. They don't have the combs of cilia. They don't have that at all. Those cilia are used for swimming. So these ones don't swim like you would see a jellyfish, where they undulate the bell and create that sort of muscular movement. They kind of just cruise around without looking like they're moving at all. But they're wiggling their little cilia around their different combs to create a water movement that makes them sort of, they don't go very fast, but they can cruise from one place to another. So they're not cnidaria because they don't have nidae. That characteristic that makes a cnidarian a cnidarian, the nidae, the stinging cells, this group doesn't have. So you're not going to get stung by a comb jelly, but you might get a tentacle wrapped around you because they still have tentacles, and their tentacles are kind of sticky. And so they hunt by essentially things getting caught in their tentacles, and then they bring that food item into their mouth.
But then are they deuterostomes or
They can,
are they deuterostomes?
oh, are they deuterostomes or protostomes? They are protostomes. Yep. So I should say, unless I mention otherwise, they're all protostomes. There's only 2 groups that we're going to talk about that are deuterostomes. We won't get to them until much later in the course. It's only the Echinodermata, the starfish group, and the corvids. So easier to remember. They're almost all protostomes, except for the last couple of groups that we're going to talk about. But I'm glad you mentioned it, because I should put that on the slide. The other thing that makes this group really fantastic and interesting is the fact that they can produce light. They have the capacity to produce bioluminescence, which is a form of light created by an organism. And that light reflects off of or is created by those little cilia in the combs. So I'm going to show you another terrible video, but it shows off this bioluminescent capacity. And then we won't have time to get into the next section, so we'll end the lecture right now. This is the forest. One of my favorite videos. Not aliens. Have a great weekend. We'll see you Monday for more fun.
Yes, I feel like. He's like.